The pain that you are carrying right now, whether it is the chronic ache that has accompanied your body for months or years, or the acute grief that has settled into your chest after a recent loss, or the more diffuse suffering that constitutes the background of your conscious existence, is not the meaningless biological signal that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to dismiss it as. The pain is not the random firing of neurons that the standard medical framework reduces it to. The pain is not the pure punishment that the popular spiritual literature has often treated it as. The pain is something more sophisticated than any of these reductions allows, with the something more being precisely what the inquiry has been working to articulate. The pain that you carry has structural features that contemporary neuroscience has begun to characterize in detail, philosophical features that the great philosophical traditions have addressed across millennia, and existential features that the world's deepest contemplative traditions have engaged with the kind of seriousness that the popular contemporary frameworks rarely match. The implications for how you can understand the pain that constitutes one of the most consistent dimensions of your embodied existence deserve sustained attention. The starting point for any serious inquiry into pain is the foundational research that has established what pain actually is at the biological level. The work of Patrick Wall and Ronald Melzack, who together formulated the gate control theory of pain in their landmark 1965 paper in the journal Science, provided the basic framework within which subsequent pain research has developed. The gate control theory established that pain is not simply the transmission of signals from injured tissue to the brain, but involves complex processing at multiple levels of the nervous system, with specific neural mechanisms gating which signals reach conscious awareness and modulating their intensity. The framework transformed the field, establishing that pain is fundamentally a constructed experience rather than the simple reception of damaged signals, with the construction involving substantial contributions from the descending pathways that the brain produces in addition to the ascending pathways that carry signals from the periphery. The implications of the gate control theory for understanding pain have been substantial. The theory provided the framework within which subsequent research has documented how attention, emotion, expectation, and context all substantially shape what is experienced as pain, with the shaping operating through specific neural mechanisms that the theory anticipated. The theory provided the framework within which the placebo response could be understood, with the descending pathways that the theory identified being the means by which expectations of pain relief produce actual pain relief. The theory provided the framework within which chronic pain could be understood, with the persistence of pain after the original injury has healed being explained through the maladaptive operation of the same gating mechanisms that ordinarily protect the organism. The cumulative effect of the framework has been one of the most influential shifts in medical thinking about pain across the past several decades. The work has been extended by numerous subsequent researchers, with the broader picture that has emerged being substantially more sophisticated than the simple stimulus-response model that earlier thinking assumed. The pain that any individual experiences is not the simple reception of damage, information from the periphery, but is the construction that the entire nervous system produces in response to the integration of multiple sources of information, including the actual peripheral signals, the contextual interpretation of those signals, the emotional state of the experiencer, and the broader narrative within which the painful experience is situated. The recognition that pain is fundamentally constructed rather than merely received has substantial implications for how the experience of pain should be understood, with the implications continuing to be worked out across both clinical and theoretical domains. The work of Tor Wager at Dartmouth College on the neural signatures of pain has provided one of the most striking developments in contemporary pain research. Wager's research, conducted using functional magnetic resonance imaging, has identified specific patterns of neural activity that correspond to the experience of pain across different individuals and different types of painful stimuli. The patterns have been characterized with sufficient precision that they can be used to predict pain intensity from neural activity alone, with the predictions being substantially accurate across different subjects and different conditions. The findings have established that pain has specific neural correlates that can be measured objectively, with the implications for clinical assessment of pain being significant, given that pain has traditionally been measurable only through subjective report. The implications of Wager's research extend beyond the merely clinical. The identification of specific neural signatures for pain provides resources for understanding how the experience of pain operates at the neural level, with the patterns being consistent enough across individuals to suggest that pain involves fundamental features of how the brain processes threat and damage, rather than being merely the idiosyncratic experience of particular individuals. The framework has provided the foundation for subsequent research on how the neural signatures change in chronic pain conditions, with the changes documenting how the pain processing system itself can be modified by extended pain experience in ways that produce ongoing suffering, even after the original injury has resolved. The work of Carl Friston at University College London on predictive processing has provided a complementary framework that has substantially influenced contemporary thinking about pain. Friston's framework, developed across decades of theoretical and empirical work, treats the brain as fundamentally a prediction-generating organ that constantly produces models of what is likely to happen and updates these models based on the discrepancy between predictions and actual sensory input. The application of this framework to pain has been one of the most productive developments in contemporary pain research, with pain being understood not as the simple reception of damage signals, but as the prediction of damage that the brain generates in response to ambiguous information about the state of the body. The implications of the predictive processing framework for understanding pain are substantial. The framework provides resources for understanding why pain often persists in the absence of any identifiable peripheral source, with the persistence being explained through the operation of predictions that have become decoupled from the actual state of the body. The framework provides resources for understanding why expectations of pain produce actual pain even in the absence of damage, with the placebo and nocebo phenomena being natural consequences of the predictive operation that the framework identifies. The framework provides resources for understanding why pain varies so substantially across different contexts and different individuals, with the variation following from the different predictions that different contexts and different prior experiences produce. The framework remains controversial in its specific applications, but it provides a context within which pain can be understood at a level of sophistication that the merely receptive framework could not provide. The work of Villayanur Ramachandran at the University of California, San Diego on phantom limb pain has provided some of the most striking demonstrations of how constructed pain actually is. Ramachandran's research, summarized in his books including Phantoms in the Brain and The Telltale Brain, has documented that patients who have lost limbs through amputation often continue to experience pain that they localize in the missing limb, with the pain being indistinguishable in subjective intensity from pain in actually present limbs. The phenomenon establishes that the experience of pain does not require any peripheral source, with the brain being capable of producing the full subjective experience of pain in body parts that no longer exist. The implications for understanding what pain actually is have been substantial, with the demonstration providing one of the clearest cases of how the brain constructs pain rather than merely receiving it. Ramachandran's development of mirror box therapy for phantom limb pain has provided one of the most striking therapeutic applications of these recognitions. The therapy involves the use of a mirror placed so that the reflection of the intact limb appears in the position of the missing limb, with the visual feedback that this produces substantially reducing the phantom pain in many patients. The success of the therapy demonstrates that the construction of pain can be modified by altering the inputs that the brain uses for the construction, with the mirror box providing visual information that contradicts the brain's prediction of damage in the missing limb. The therapeutic success has substantial implications for understanding how the constructed nature of pain can be addressed clinically, with the implications having influenced subsequent therapeutic approaches across multiple pain conditions. The work of Howard Fields at the University of California, San Francisco, on endogenous pain modulation has documented the specific neural pathways through which the brain modifies pain experience. Fields' research has characterized the descending pathways from the brain to the spinal cord that release endogenous opioids and other neurotransmitters that modify pain transmission, with the pathways being the means by which the gating mechanisms that Wall and Melzack identified actually operate. The framework provides the neural foundation for understanding how attention, emotion, expectation, and context modify pain experience, with the modifications operating through specific neurochemical mechanisms that the research has characterized in detail. The implications for clinical practice have been substantial, with the understanding of endogenous modulation providing the foundation for various therapeutic approaches that work with, rather than against, the brain's natural pain modulation systems. The work of Irene Tracy at Oxford University has extended these findings through detailed neuroimaging studies of how pain is processed across different conditions. Tracy's research has documented how attention, anticipation, mood, and context all substantially modify the neural processing of pain, with the modifications operating at specific neural levels that her research has characterized. The framework provides one of the most comprehensive contemporary accounts of how psychological factors influence pain experience, with the influence being mediated through specific neural mechanisms, rather than being merely a matter of report bias or psychological projection. The convergence between Tracy's research and the broader frameworks of Wager, Friston, and Fields has produced a substantially complete contemporary account of how pain operates at the biological level. The work of Sean Mackey at Stanford University has further developed these recognitions through research on chronic pain conditions, with the findings documenting how chronic pain involves substantive changes in the pain processing system itself. Mackey's research has shown that chronic pain conditions are associated with changes in brain structure and function that exceed what would be expected from the persistent stimulation of pain pathways alone, with the changes documenting that chronic pain transforms the brain rather than merely persistent in it. The implications for understanding chronic pain have been substantial, with the recognition that chronic pain is a different condition from acute pain, rather than merely a longer version of the same condition, having transformed how chronic pain is treated clinically. The recognition that chronic pain transforms the brain, rather than merely persisting in it, has implications that exceed the merely clinical. The framework suggests that the experience of chronic suffering is not merely the prolonged endurance of acute suffering, but is a distinct condition with its own neural foundations, with the implications for how the engagement with chronic suffering should be approached being significant. The frameworks that the contemplative traditions have developed for working with persistent suffering, including the Buddhist framework of working with dukkha across the entire span of conscious existence, and the Christian framework of accompanying chronic suffering through the cultivation of meaning and faith, take on additional significance when read alongside this contemporary research. The convergence between contemporary findings about chronic pain and traditional articulations about persistent suffering provides resources for clinical and pastoral practice that the merely clinical or merely traditional frameworks alone could not provide. There is a particular line of research that bears directly on the questions about suffering that the inquiry will eventually examine, and that has produced findings that exceed what the merely physical pain framework would predict. The work of Naomi Eisenberger at the University of California, Los Angeles on social pain has documented that the neural mechanisms that produce the experience of physical pain are substantially overlapping with the neural mechanisms that produce the experience of social rejection and loss. Eisenberger's research, conducted using functional magnetic resonance imaging during experimental paradigms that produce social rejection, has shown that the same brain regions that activate during physical pain also activate during social rejection, with the pattern being consistent enough that the experience of social rejection genuinely involves something like physical pain at the neural level, rather than being merely metaphorically painful. The specific paradigm that Eisenberger and her collaborators developed, often called the cyberball paradigm, involves subjects participating in what they believe to be an online ball-tossing game with other players, with the experimental manipulation involving the gradual exclusion of the subject from the game. The subjective experience of being excluded, even in this minimal experimental context with people the subject has never met, produces neural activation patterns that overlap substantially with the patterns produced by physical pain. The findings have been replicated across multiple studies and extended to various forms of social wound, including the experience of being separated from loved ones, the experience of relationship breakup, and the experience of grief following death of close persons. The convergent findings across these different types of social pain establish that the neural mechanisms involved are general mechanisms for processing social wounds, rather than being specific to any particular type of social rejection. The work has been extended by Mary Frances O'Connor at the University of Arizona, whose research on grief has documented that the loss of close persons produces neural and physiological changes that exceed what the merely psychological framework would predict. O'Connor's research, summarized in her book The Grieving Brain, has shown that the brain develops specific neural representations of close persons that operate even during their physical absence, with the loss of the person producing the disruption of these representations in ways that resemble the neural processes involved in withdrawal from physical addiction. The framework has substantial implications for understanding why grief produces the specific suffering it does, with the suffering being the consequence of neural disruptions that are continuous with, rather than different from, the disruptions involved in other forms of pain. The implications of Eisenberger's research and the subsequent extensions are substantial. The findings suggest that the suffering that follows from loss, rejection, betrayal, and other social and relational wounds involves neural mechanisms that are continuous with the mechanisms that produce physical pain, with the implications being that suffering is unified at the neural level in ways that the dominant cultural framework's distinction between physical and emotional pain does not capture. The findings have parallels with the recognitions that various contemplative traditions have articulated about the unified nature of suffering, with a convergence between contemporary neuroscience and traditional articulations being one of the features that the broader inquiry will eventually examine. The research provides empirical support for treating physical and emotional suffering as continuous phenomena rather than as fundamentally different categories, with the implications for how suffering should be approached being significant. The philosophical engagement with suffering has its own substantial history that runs parallel to the empirical research. The work of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher whose engagement with suffering across his entire body of work has been one of the most influential contributions to Western thinking about these questions, articulated frameworks within which suffering is understood not as merely a problem to be eliminated, but as a constitutive dimension of human existence that has its own meaning and its own potential for transformation. The famous formulation that what does not kill us makes us stronger, articulated in Twilight of the Idols, captures only part of what Nietzsche's broader engagement with suffering involved, with the deeper recognition being that the relationship to suffering is one of the most consequential choices that conscious existence presents. Nietzsche's broader engagement with suffering, developed across his books including The Birth of Tragedy, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morality, articulated a framework within which the Dionysian dimension of human experience, that includes ecstatic engagement with the painful and disordered features of existence is recognized as one of the legitimate dimensions of conscious life, rather than as merely a problem to be controlled. The framework has been controversial, with various subsequent philosophers offering important criticisms of specific elements, but the framework articulates a recognition about suffering that exceeds what the merely therapeutic framework would allow. The recognition is that suffering is woven into the structure of conscious existence in ways that the elimination of suffering would require the elimination of substantial features of what conscious existence actually involves. Nietzsche's specific concept of amor fati, the love of fate, articulated in his autobiographical work Ecce Homo and developed across his other writings, provides one of the most philosophically demanding articulations of how the relationship to suffering can be transformed without the elimination of the suffering itself. The concept holds that the genuinely affirmative relationship to existence requires not merely the acceptance of what has occurred, but the active willing of what has occurred, with the willing being the means by which conscious existence claims its own life rather than merely enduring it. The framework has been controversial, with critics noting that the framework can be misapplied to circumstances where genuine evil rather than mere difficulty has been encountered. But the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between suffering and the affirmation of life that has continued to influence subsequent philosophical reflection on these questions. The work of Simone Weil, the French philosopher and mystic whose engagement with suffering across her too brief life produced one of the most distinctive articulations within the Western tradition, addressed these questions with particular depth. Weil distinguished what she called malheur, often translated as affliction, from ordinary suffering, with malheur being the kind of suffering that destroys the soul rather than refining it. The framework that Weil articulated in her essays, including the foundational essay on affliction in her collection Waiting for God, provides one of the most rigorous philosophical attempts to distinguish the different kinds of suffering that conscious existence can encounter, with the distinction being important for understanding why some forms of suffering have transformative potential while others do not. The framework has been one of the more sophisticated philosophical contributions to thinking about suffering in the 20th century. Weil's specific characterization of malheur draws on her own observations and experiences working in factories and engaging with the lives of those at the margins of mid-20th century European society. She characterized malheur as suffering that combines physical pain, social degradation, and psychological humiliation in ways that destroy the capacity of the soul to engage with reality at all. The framework distinguishes this destructive form of suffering from the kinds of suffering that have transformative potential, with the distinction being important for clinical and pastoral practice. The honest acknowledgement is that not all suffering is the same, with some forms producing genuine transformation while others produce only destruction, and the discernment between these forms being one of the central concerns of any serious engagement with suffering. Weil's broader framework treated attention as the fundamental capacity that allows conscious existence to engage with reality at the depth that genuine engagement requires, with attention being itself a form of suffering in the sense of bearing the weight of what is encountered. The framework has been influential in subsequent contemplative philosophy, with the integration of attention and suffering that Weil articulated, providing one of the more original contributions to thinking about these questions. The implications for understanding what suffering actually involves are subtle but significant, with the recognition that genuine attention requires bearing the weight of what is attended to, providing a context within which suffering takes on a different character than the merely passive endurance that the standard framework would suggest. The work of Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist whose Man's Search for Meaning has been one of the most widely read works on suffering in the 20th century, articulated a framework that has substantially shaped popular thinking about these questions. Frankl, who survived imprisonment in Nazi concentration camps including Auschwitz, developed his framework in part through reflection on the experiences that he witnessed and endured during this period. The framework holds that human beings retain the capacity to find meaning even in the most extreme circumstances of suffering, with the capacity being one of the central features that distinguishes conscious existence from mere biological persistence. The framework has been controversial in some respects, with critics noting that the framework can be used to minimize the actual horror of extreme suffering or to place excessive responsibility on victims for finding meaning in circumstances that may simply be meaningless. But the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between suffering and meaning that has resonated widely. Frankl's specific observations from his time in the camps deserve careful attention because of what they document about the relationship between meaning and survival. Frankl observed that prisoners who maintained some sense of meaning, whether through love of family members they hoped to see again, through commitment to work they hoped to complete, or through religious faith that connected them to dimensions of reality beyond the camps, had different patterns of survival than prisoners who had lost all sense of meaning. The observations are not the simple claim that meaning saves lives, with the actual outcomes depending on countless factors that exceeded any prisoner's capacity to control. The observations are the more subtle claim that the relationship to meaning shaped the experience of suffering and the capacity to maintain humanity within circumstances that systematically attempted to destroy humanity. The framework has continued to be influential in clinical practice, particularly in the treatment of patients facing terminal illness or other forms of suffering that cannot be eliminated. Frankl's specific clinical contribution through the development of logotherapy provided a framework within which the engagement with suffering operates through the cultivation of meaning rather than through the elimination of the suffering itself. The framework has continued to be influential in clinical practice, with the recognition that the relationship to suffering substantially shapes the experience of suffering being one of the foundations of contemporary approaches to chronic pain and other persistent suffering conditions. The integration of Frankl's framework with the contemporary pain research that we have examined produces a substantially complete contemporary account of how the experience of suffering can be transformed without the elimination of the underlying conditions that produce the suffering. The work of Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher whose 19th century engagement with suffering produced one of the most influential pessimistic frameworks in Western philosophy, deserves brief acknowledgement within this broader context. Schopenhauer's claim that suffering is the fundamental condition of conscious existence, with happiness being merely the temporary absence of suffering rather than a positive state in its own right, has been controversial across subsequent philosophy, but has continued to influence thinking about these questions. The framework provides a useful counterpoint to the more optimistic frameworks that other thinkers have developed, with a recognition that suffering may be more fundamental to existence than the dominant cultural framework suggests, being one of the contributions that pessimistic philosophy has made to the broader inquiry. The framework has parallels with the Buddhist articulation of dukkha as the fundamental condition that the contemplative path addresses, with the convergence between Schopenhauer and the Buddhist tradition that influenced him being one of the more interesting points in the history of these questions. The contemplative traditions have, for thousands of years, addressed the questions about suffering with their own different methods and within their own different frameworks. The Christian tradition has developed extensive theological reflection on suffering, with the doctrine of Theologia Crucis and the sustained engagement with the Book of Job providing some of the most philosophically sophisticated treatments within the tradition. The Buddhist tradition has placed dukkha, suffering, at the center of its entire framework, with the Four Noble Truths beginning with the recognition of suffering as the fundamental condition that the path addresses. The Islamic tradition has developed the framework of sabr, patience or steadfastness, as one of the central virtues of religious life, with the framework providing resources for understanding how the engagement with suffering can be conducted within the broader religious life. The Hindu tradition has articulated the framework of Dvandva, the pairs of opposites, including pleasure and pain, as features of the embodied existence that the spiritual life works to engage rather than to eliminate. The Stoic philosophical tradition has developed its own framework within which suffering is understood as one of the indifferent features of existence that does not affect the fundamental virtue that the philosophical life cultivates. The convergence between these traditional articulations and the contemporary research is one of the features that the broader inquiry will eventually examine in detail. What is striking about the convergence of these traditions is not merely that they all recognize suffering as significant. What is striking is the specific structural features that recur across the different accounts. The traditions consistently treat suffering as more than the merely physiological phenomenon that the materialist framework treats it as, with the more being articulated in different vocabularies, but with the structural recognition being consistent. The traditions consistently distinguish between different forms of suffering that have different transformative potentials, with the wild distinction between malheur and ordinary suffering having parallels in the more sophisticated traditional accounts that distinguish suffering that refines from suffering that destroys. The traditions consistently develop practices for the engagement with suffering, with the practices ranging from the contemplative engagement that the Christian tradition has developed to the meditation on dukkha that the Buddhist tradition has refined, to the cultivation of sabba that the Islamic tradition has articulated. And the traditions consistently locate suffering within broader frameworks of meaning that connect the individual experience to larger patterns that the individual existence participates in. The convergence of these specific structural features across widely separated traditions, despite the different vocabularies and metaphysical frameworks within which the traditions operated, is one of the features that the inquiry will eventually examine in detail. The Mevlevi tradition that developed around the teachings of Jalal al-Din Rumi has articulated one of the most distinctive treatments of suffering within the broader Islamic mystical tradition. The famous verse in which Rumi observes that the wound is the place where the light enters captures a recognition that has parallels in various other traditions, but that Rumi articulated with particular poetic depth. The treatment will be examined in detail in the later stage of the inquiry, but the preliminary recognition is that the Sufi tradition has resources for thinking about suffering that exceed what the merely therapeutic framework provides, with the resources being grounded in careful spiritual practice rather than merely religious commitment. The convergence between Rumi's articulation and the broader recognition across other traditions that suffering can be a means of transformation rather than merely an obstacle to flourishing is one of the features that the study of these traditions reveals. What the contemporary research has begun to suggest, when it is considered alongside these contemplative traditions, is that the question of what suffering actually involves may not be the merely physiological question that materialist frameworks have treated it as. The question may be a question about the fundamental structure of conscious existence and its relationship to embodiment, with answers that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions are all in a position to engage from their own different angles. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own pre-scientific vocabularies recognitions about the structure of suffering that contemporary research is now in a position to confirm or refine through its own different methods. The convergence is not coincidence. The convergence is the consequence of the fact that the traditions were attending carefully to features of suffering that have a real basis in how consciousness is actually structured, even when the technical resources for articulating this basis were not yet available. The body that reads these words has, across the years of its existence, accumulated what feels like a continuous record of suffering that constitutes substantial portions of the felt sense of who you are. The findings that contemporary research has documented suggest that this suffering is substantially more sophisticated than ordinary perception would suggest. The pain that you carry is not simply the reception of damage signals, but is the active construction that your nervous system produces from multiple sources of information. The suffering that follows from loss and rejection involves neural mechanisms that overlap substantially with the mechanisms of physical pain. The chronic pain that you may carry has transformed the very pain processing system that produces it, with the transformation being one of the features that makes chronic pain a different condition from acute pain, rather than merely a longer version. None of this is hypothetical. All of this is the documented condition of your actual existence as a suffering being. The question is what these findings actually mean, what they tell us about the nature of conscious existence, and how the various frameworks that have been examining suffering can be brought into productive engagement with each other. The next stage of the inquiry will examine the deeper physical theories that have been developed to address these questions, with particular attention to the work on quantum approaches to consciousness and to the broader frameworks within which the documented phenomena of suffering can be understood as more than the merely physiological constructions that the standard framework has assumed. There is something fundamentally wrong with the standard model of pain. The findings we have examined establish that pain is not the simple reception of damage signals, but is the active construction that the entire nervous system produces from multiple sources of information, with the construction involving features that exceed what the merely physiological framework would predict. The neuroscience findings are real. The neural mechanisms are increasingly characterized. The phenomenology of constructed pain is well documented, but the standard neuroscience framework, despite the sophistication of its findings, leaves a deeper question unaddressed. The question concerns what the experience of suffering actually is when we have set aside the simple reception model that ordinary thinking assumed, and what kind of relationship the experience has to the underlying conditions that the experience is supposed to be about. The materialist framework treats suffering as the brain's construction of pain experience from peripheral signals and contextual information, with the construction being the totality of what suffering involves. But the materialist framework does not address whether suffering might involve features of consciousness and reality that exceed what the merely neural construction would account for. The question that opens the inquiry that follows is whether contemporary physics has anything to contribute to this deeper question, and what the implications might be for how the documented phenomena of suffering should be understood. The starting point for this deeper inquiry is the predictive processing framework that we considered in our earlier examination of contemporary pain research. The framework, developed most fully by Carl Friston at University College London, treats the brain as fundamentally a prediction-generating organ that constantly produces models of what is likely to happen, and updates these models based on the discrepancy between predictions and actual sensory input. The application of this framework to pain has been one of the most productive developments in contemporary pain research, with pain being understood not as the simple reception of damage signals, but as the prediction of damage that the brain generates in response to ambiguous information about the state of the body. The deeper implications of the predictive processing framework emerge when its specific predictions for chronic suffering are examined in detail. The framework predicts that chronic suffering should involve the operation of predictions that have become decoupled from the actual state of the body or the actual circumstances of the sufferer, with the decoupling producing the persistence of suffering that exceeds what the actual circumstances would warrant. The framework predicts that the suffering of those who anticipate harm should activate the same neural mechanisms that the actual harm would activate, with the anticipation being itself a form of suffering, rather than merely a precursor to suffering. The framework predicts that the relationship between the sufferer and the suffering should be modifiable through the modification of the predictions that produce the suffering, with the modification operating through specific cognitive and contextual interventions that the framework can characterize. The framework provides resources for understanding why suffering has the specific persistence it has, and why specific therapeutic approaches that work with the predictive structure of suffering have been more effective than approaches that ignore this structure. The clinical applications of the predictive processing framework to chronic pain have been substantial. The work of Lorimer Moseley at the University of South Australia, conducted in collaboration with various other pain researchers, has translated the predictive processing framework into therapeutic approaches that work with the predictive structure of chronic pain rather than against it. The approaches that Moseley and his colleagues have developed, summarized in his books, including Explain Pain, have produced documented benefits for chronic pain patients through the modification of the predictions that maintain their suffering. The framework treats the chronic pain experience as the brain's prediction of damage that has become detached from the actual state of the body, with a therapeutic intervention being the gradual modification of these predictions through specific cognitive and behavioral interventions. The success of these approaches provides empirical support for the broader predictive processing framework, while demonstrating that the framework has practical implications for the treatment of chronic suffering. The framework has been extended by Anil Seth at the University of Sussex, whose work on the predictive processing framework has produced one of the most accessible contemporary articulations of how the brain constructs experience, including pain experience. Seth's framework, summarized in his book Being You, treats the entire conscious experience, including the experience of suffering, as the brain's controlled hallucination, with the hallucination being controlled in the sense that it is constrained by the actual sensory input that the brain receives, but being a hallucination in the sense that it is the brain's construction rather than the direct reception of an externally given reality. The framework has been controversial in some respects, but the framework articulates a recognition about the constructed nature of conscious experience that has substantial implications for understanding suffering. The implications are subtle but significant, with the recognition that suffering is the brain's controlled hallucination of damage, providing a context within which the engagement with suffering can be understood as the engagement with a constructed experience rather than as the endurance of an externally given reality. Seth's broader framework treats consciousness itself as fundamentally predictive, with the conscious experience that we ordinarily take ourselves to have being the brain's best guess about what is happening based on the available evidence. The framework has parallels with the broader phenomenological tradition that has examined how conscious experience is constituted, with Seth's framework providing empirical support for what the phenomenological tradition had articulated through its own different methods. The implications for understanding suffering follow naturally. Suffering is, on the framework, the brain's best guess about the state of the body and the circumstances of the sufferer, with the guess being shaped by all the factors that influence the brain's predictive operations, including prior experience, current context, attention, and emotional state. The framework provides resources for understanding why the same physical conditions can produce vastly different suffering experiences across different individuals and different contexts, with the variation following from the different predictions that different brains produce in response to the available evidence. The careful position with respect to this framework requires acknowledging both what it offers and what it does not establish. The predictive processing framework provides resources for understanding pain that exceed what the simple reception model allows, with the framework being supported by substantial empirical work across multiple research programs. The framework does not by itself establish that pain is merely a construction with no relationship to the underlying conditions, with the predictions being constrained by actual peripheral signals and actual environmental conditions in ways that the simpler controlled hallucination metaphor can obscure. The framework provides a sophisticated context within which pain can be understood, but the framework does not eliminate the reality of the underlying damage that pain typically reflects. The honest engagement with the framework requires preserving these distinctions rather than collapsing them into the simpler frameworks that popular literature has sometimes offered. The work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff on the quantum substrate of consciousness, which we considered in earlier inquiries, has direct implications for how suffering should be understood at the deepest level. The orchestrated objective reduction theory holds that consciousness is associated with quantum coherent states in microtubules within neurons, with the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involving the orchestrated collapse of these quantum states. The framework has implications for how suffering should be understood within the broader picture of consciousness that the framework articulates. If consciousness is itself a quantum mechanical phenomenon, then suffering may involve features of quantum mechanics that the merely classical framework cannot capture. The specific implications have been articulated by Hameroff and his collaborators across various publications, with the framework providing resources for thinking about why suffering has the specific properties it has, including its capacity to persist beyond the apparent removal of its causes and its resistance to simple elimination through medical interventions that target only the peripheral conditions. The specific predictions of the framework for the experience of suffering have been articulated in considerable detail. Hameroff has proposed that the moment-to-moment generation of conscious experience involves quantum coherent processing that integrates information across the brain in ways that the merely classical framework cannot capture, with the integration being the means by which the unified subjective experience that we ordinarily take ourselves to have is produced. The implications for understanding suffering are direct. The unified subjective experience of suffering, with its specific qualitative character including the felt awfulness of pain and the urgency of escape, may be the consequence of the quantum coherent processing that the framework identifies as the substrate of consciousness in general. The framework provides resources for understanding why suffering has the specific binding properties it does, with the various features of suffering being integrated into a unified experience through processes that the merely classical framework cannot adequately address. The empirical work that has been conducted to test the predictions of the orchestrated objective reduction framework has produced findings of substantial interest for understanding suffering. The work of Anirban Bandyopadhyay at the National Institute for Materials Science in Japan, conducted in collaboration with Hameroff, has documented quantum coherent vibrations in microtubules under physiologically relevant conditions, with the findings being consistent with the framework's predictions. The 2024 work of Mike Wiest and his collaborators at Wellesley College, examining the effects of microtubule stabilizing anesthetics on consciousness, has provided additional empirical support for the broader framework, with the studies documenting that anesthetics that bind to microtubules produce specific effects on consciousness that are consistent with the predictions of the orchestrated objective reduction theory. The implications for understanding suffering follow from the same theoretical foundation, with suffering being a particular configuration of the quantum coherent processing that the framework identifies as the substrate of consciousness in general. The clinical implications are interesting, with anesthesia being one of the most reliable means of eliminating suffering, and the mechanisms of anesthesia being precisely the disruption of the microtubule processing that the Penrose-Hameroff framework identifies as the substrate of conscious experience. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests it has provides another framework within which the questions about suffering can be reformulated. The block universe interpretation of relativity, articulated most fully in the philosophical work of various physicists and philosophers, holds that the past, present, and future all exist with equal reality, with the apparent flow of time being a feature of conscious experience rather than a feature of the underlying physical structure. The framework derives from the implications of special relativity for the relationship between simultaneity and reference frames, with different observers having different definitions of what counts as simultaneous and the implications for any privilege present being substantial. The framework has been articulated by physicists including Hermann Minkowski in the early 20th century and developed by subsequent thinkers including Hilary Putnam, Brian Greene, and various others working at the intersection of physics and philosophy. The implications of the block universe framework for understanding suffering are striking. If all moments exist with equal reality in the broader space-time structure on the framework, then the suffering that conscious beings experience exists within this broader structure rather than being eliminated by the passage of time. The framework provides a precise vocabulary within which the persistence of suffering through time can be formulated, with the persistence being not the continuation of the same suffering across changing moments, but the existence of the suffering at the moments where it occurs. The framework has implications for how the relationship to past suffering should be understood, with the past suffering being not eliminated by being past, but existing as a feature of the broader structure of reality that the conscious being's life occupies. The framework is speculative in its specific applications, but it provides a precise vocabulary within which the question of what relationship suffering has to time can be formulated in ways that exceed what the merely classical framework allows. The framework has equally striking implications for the relationship to future suffering. If future moments exist with equal reality to present moments in the broader space-time structure, then the anticipation of future suffering that produces present suffering is not the merely psychological projection that ordinary thinking might assume, but is the present consciousness's engagement with future moments that genuinely exist. The framework provides resources for understanding why the anticipation of suffering produces the same neural activation as the actual suffering, with the activation being the consciousness's engagement with future moments that have a real existence in the broader structure, rather than being merely the simulation of moments that do not exist. The framework remains speculative in its specific applications, but the resources it provides for thinking about why suffering operates the way it does are substantial. The framework also has implications for the question of whether suffering is genuinely eliminated by death, or whether the suffering that occurred in a life retains its existence in the broader structure even after the death of the conscious being who experienced it. The question is one of the more subtle implications of the framework, with the implications being substantial for thinking about the meaning of suffering across the span of a life. If the suffering that conscious beings experience exists permanently in the broader space-time structure, even after the deaths of the beings who experienced it, then the suffering has a kind of permanence that the merely temporal view cannot capture. The framework does not establish what this permanence ultimately means, but the framework provides resources for thinking about the relationship between individual suffering and the broader structure of reality in ways that exceed what the merely materialist framework allows. The work on retrocausality and the time-symmetric formulation of quantum mechanics by Yakir Aharonov and his collaborators provides additional resources that bear on the questions about suffering. The two-state vector formalism, articulated by Aharonov and his colleagues across many papers, treats quantum systems as being constrained by both initial and final boundary conditions, with the present state of the system being shaped by both its past and its future. The implications of this framework for suffering are subtle but significant. If the present states of physical systems, including brains, are constrained by future as well as past boundary conditions on the framework, then the suffering that the brain produces may be shaped by the future trajectory of the brain, as well as by the past events that the suffering seems to be about. The framework is speculative in its specific applications to suffering, but it provides a precise vocabulary within which the question of how suffering might be shaped by future conditions as well as past ones can be formulated. The implications of the retrocausality framework for the question of meaning in suffering are particularly interesting. If present suffering is shaped not only by past circumstances but also by the future trajectory of the sufferer, then the meaning that suffering takes on in retrospect may be one of the features that shapes the actual experience of the suffering as it occurs. The framework provides resources for understanding why the same painful circumstances can produce different suffering experiences across different individuals, depending on the broader context of their lives, with the variation being shaped not merely by past factors, but by the trajectory that the life ultimately takes. The framework remains speculative in its strongest forms, but the resources it provides for thinking about why suffering and meaning are connected in the specific ways that careful observation reveals are substantial. There is a particular set of claims that has been made in popular literature on suffering that deserves explicit examination because it has been the source of substantial confusion and substantial damage to those who have adopted it uncritically. The claims involve the proposition that suffering is the result of low vibrational frequencies that the sufferer can transform through specific manifestation techniques, with the claims often citing quantum physics as the foundation for the framework. These claims have appeared in various books, online courses, and social media content that has presented itself as bringing scientific evidence to bear on questions about suffering. The claims have to be addressed directly because they distort what the actual research establishes and because they have shaped popular understanding of these topics in ways that exceed what the science supports. The careful position requires distinguishing what the actual research establishes from what the popular claims have added. The contemporary research on pain that we have examined has established that pain is constructed rather than merely received, with the construction being subject to modification through cognitive and contextual interventions. The contemporary physics has established that classical determinism is not the deepest description of physical reality, with quantum mechanics providing a more sophisticated framework. The combination of these recognitions has been seized upon by popularizers to develop frameworks that treat suffering as the manifestation of particular vibrational frequencies that the sufferer can change through specific techniques. The frameworks have no support in the actual physics or the actual neuroscience. The specific reasons for rejecting these popular claims deserve examination because the rejection is not merely a matter of skeptical caution, but follows from specific features of the actual physics. The claim that suffering operates through vibrational frequencies invokes the notion that quantum systems exhibit specific frequencies that can be modified through conscious intention. The actual physics provides no support for this framework. Quantum systems do exhibit frequencies in the technical sense, that energy levels correspond to specific frequencies through the Planck relation, but these frequencies are not the kind of thing that can be modified through conscious intention. The decoherence problem that we have examined in connection with other popular quantum claims applies equally here. The macroscopic conditions of human consciousness do not maintain the kind of coherent quantum states that would be required for conscious intention to modify quantum properties in the way that the popular framework imagines, with the work of Max Tegmark at MIT having established that decoherence eliminates such states on timescales far shorter than would be required for conscious processing. The specific popular framework that has produced perhaps the greatest damage is the one that has emerged from the integration of the law of attraction with quasi-quantum vocabulary. The framework, articulated in various popular books and films across the past several decades, holds that the sufferer attracts their suffering through the vibrational frequency of their thoughts, and that they can eliminate their suffering through the deliberate cultivation of higher vibrational frequencies through positive thinking and visualization. The framework has been applied to circumstances ranging from financial difficulty to chronic illness to the death of loved ones, with the implication being that those who suffer such circumstances have somehow attracted them through their vibrational state. The framework has no support in either the actual physics or the actual research on suffering, and the framework has produced documented harm in those who have adopted it uncritically. The popular framework that treats suffering as the result of low vibrational frequencies and that proposes specific techniques for raising these frequencies has been particularly damaging in clinical contexts. The framework has been used to suggest that those who suffer chronic illness or chronic pain are responsible for their suffering through their inadequate vibrational state, with the implications for chronic illness sufferers being substantial. The framework has been used to delay or replace evidence-based medical treatment in favor of vibrational practices that have no documented therapeutic effect, with the consequences for those who follow this advice having included worsening of treatable conditions and, in some documented cases, premature death. The honest acknowledgement is that the framework is not merely theoretically confused, but has produced substantial real-world harm in the people who have adopted it uncritically. The careful position is not the dismissal of all spiritual or contemplative engagement with suffering. The contemplative traditions that we have examined provide substantial resources for engaging with suffering, with the engagement being grounded in moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The recognition that the relationship to suffering matters and that this relationship can be cultivated through specific practices is consistent with what the contemplative traditions have actually taught, even as the specific framework of vibrational manifestation is incompatible with both the actual physics and the actual traditions. The honest engagement with suffering requires distinguishing what has been established by careful research and traditional practice from what has been added through cultural projection and commercial exploitation. A related popular framework that deserves caution is the broader manifestation framework that treats suffering as the result of incorrect thinking that the sufferer can change through specific mental techniques. The framework, articulated in various popular books and courses, holds that the sufferer's suffering follows from their thoughts and that changing the thoughts will eliminate the suffering. The framework has elements of truth, with the recognition that cognitive interpretation of circumstances substantially influences the experience of those circumstances, being supported by the contemporary cognitive research. But the framework as commonly articulated goes substantially beyond what the actual research supports, with the implication that any suffering can be eliminated through correct thinking, being incompatible with both the actual neuroscience and the actual circumstances of much human suffering. The framework has been used to dismiss the genuine suffering of those facing circumstances that no amount of correct thinking can change, with the consequences for those subjected to this dismissal having included additional suffering on top of the original conditions. The careful position recognizes the partial truth in the framework, while resisting its overextension into territory where it does not apply. Another popular framework that deserves examination is the toxic positivity framework that has emerged in contemporary self-help culture. The framework treats the expression of suffering as itself a problem to be eliminated, with the implication being that those who acknowledge their suffering are creating their suffering through the very acknowledgement. The framework has been criticized by various contemporary psychologists, including Susan David at Harvard Medical School, whose research on emotional agility has documented that the suppression of difficult emotions, including the emotions associated with suffering, tends to amplify rather than reduce the suffering. The framework that David and other contemporary researchers have developed treats the acknowledgement and engagement with difficult emotions as one of the means by which the suffering associated with those emotions can be transformed, with the framework being substantially supported by the contemporary research. The convergence between this contemporary research and the recognitions that the contemplative traditions have articulated about the appropriate engagement with suffering is one of the features that the broader inquiry will eventually examine. The position that has been articulated by David Chalmers, Galen Strawson, and other contemporary philosophers concerning the relationship between consciousness and physical substrate provides a complementary framework for thinking about suffering. If consciousness is, as the various proto-panpsychist positions suggest, a fundamental feature of physical reality rather than an emergent product of complex physical configurations, then suffering may involve features of consciousness that the merely materialist framework cannot capture. The framework provides resources for thinking about why suffering has the specific phenomenological features it has, with the qualitative character of pain experience and the felt urgency of suffering being natural consequences of the fundamental status of consciousness that the framework articulates. The framework is speculative in its specific applications, but it provides a precise philosophical vocabulary within which the questions about suffering can be formulated more rigorously than the merely materialist framework allows. The specific contribution that Chalmers' work has made to these questions has been the rigorous articulation of why the materialist framework faces fundamental difficulties in accounting for the qualitative character of conscious experience. The hard problem of consciousness, as Chalmers articulated it in his 1995 paper in the Journal of Consciousness Studies and developed in his subsequent book, The Conscious Mind, identifies the gap between any physical description of brain processes and the subjective experience that the processes seem to produce. The implications for understanding suffering follow from the broader framework. The experience of suffering, with its specific qualitative character including the felt awfulness of pain, the urgency of escape, and the affective texture of grief, has features that resist reduction to physical processes, in the same way that other forms of conscious experience resist this reduction. The framework does not by itself establish what suffering actually involves at the deepest level, but the framework provides a context within which the question can be formulated rigorously rather than dismissed. The work of Galen Strawson on the metaphysics of consciousness has provided complementary resources for thinking about suffering at the deepest level. Strawson's framework, articulated in his 2006 paper Realistic Monism and developed in subsequent publications, holds that any genuine physicalism must include consciousness as a fundamental feature of physical reality rather than treating consciousness as an emergent product of arrangements of allegedly non-conscious matter. The implications for understanding suffering follow from the broader framework. If consciousness is fundamental, then the qualitative character of suffering, with its felt awfulness and its urgency, may be a feature of the deeper physical structure rather than merely an emergent product of complex neural arrangements. The framework remains controversial within mainstream philosophy of mind, but the framework articulates a recognition that has substantial implications for how suffering should be understood. The convergence between Strawson's position and the various other proto-panpsychist positions that have been articulated in contemporary philosophy of mind provides a substantial body of philosophical work within which the questions about suffering can be formulated. The application of these frameworks to pain specifically has been worked out in detail by various contemporary philosophers, including Barry Maund and other writers in the philosophy of pain. The frameworks that have emerged treat the qualitative character of pain experience as one of the most striking examples of the explanatory gap that Chalmers identified, with the felt awfulness of pain being precisely the kind of qualitative feature that resists reductive explanation. The frameworks do not establish any specific alternative to the materialist account as the correct account of pain, but the frameworks establish that the materialist objection, the claim that the principles of physics and philosophy of mind rule out any deeper account of pain, is not actually supported by careful examination. The principles of physics and philosophy, properly understood, are consistent with deeper accounts that the contemplative traditions have articulated. The convergence of these various frameworks on the recognition that the deepest structure of reality involves features that the merely materialist framework cannot adequately capture provides a context within which the documented phenomena of suffering can be understood without forcing them into the materialist mold. The frameworks do not establish any specific alternative to the materialist account as the correct account of suffering. The frameworks establish that the materialist objection, the claim that the principles of physics and philosophy of mind rule out any deeper account of suffering, is not actually supported by careful examination. The principles of physics and philosophy, properly understood, are consistent with deeper accounts that the contemplative traditions have articulated. But the consistency is not equivalent to demonstration, and the strongest forms of the alternative accounts remain speculative, even as they are framed within the rigorous physics and philosophy that have been established. The careful position with respect to all of these frameworks is to recognize what they offer and what they do not offer for the inquiry into suffering. They offer alternatives to the materialist framework that has dominated mainstream discussion, with the alternatives being grounded in serious physics and philosophy. They do not offer definitive answers to the questions about what suffering actually involves, with the questions remaining open in ways that current research is working to address. They provide a context within which the contemplative traditions, which have addressed these questions across thousands of years, can be engaged seriously rather than dismissed as merely the products of pre-scientific thinking. The traditions, on this convergent reading, may have been articulating in their own different vocabularies recognitions about the structure of suffering that the contemporary physics is now in a position to engage with seriously. What this means in practical terms for understanding suffering deserves brief consideration before the inquiry moves to its next stage. The frameworks that we have examined do not establish that suffering is somehow not real, or that it can be eliminated through specific techniques. The frameworks establish that suffering is more sophisticated than the merely physiological framework would suggest, with features that exceed what the merely classical framework can capture. The implications for clinical and pastoral practice are that the engagement with suffering should preserve the recognition that suffering involves features that exceed the merely peripheral conditions, with the engagement working with these deeper features rather than ignoring them. The traditions that we will examine in the next stage have developed substantial resources for this kind of engagement, with the resources being grounded in moral and spiritual seriousness that the popular distortions abandon. The next stage of the inquiry will examine these traditional articulations in detail, with the recognition that the traditions and the contemporary research are addressing the same underlying phenomenon from their own different angles, and that the convergence between them is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought about what suffering actually is and what role it plays in conscious existence. Long before any laboratory could measure the neural signatures of pain or any framework existed for thinking about predictive processing, contemplative thinkers in widely separated cultures arrived at structurally parallel pictures of what suffering actually is and what role it plays in conscious existence. The methods used were not measurement and theory in the modern technical sense. The methods used were sustained attention to suffering itself, to the contemplative practices that engage suffering directly while it is still present, and to the philosophical reflection on what suffering must be if it is the kind of thing that the traditions have observed it to be across thousands of years of careful examination. What these thinkers found, in their own different vocabularies, was that suffering is not merely the biological signal that the materialist framework treats it as, but is a fundamental feature of how conscious existence operates, and how the embodied life engages with dimensions of reality that exceed the merely peripheral. The convergence between these contemplative recognitions and what contemporary research has begun to document about suffering is one of the most striking convergences in the entire history of human thought, and the deeper inquiry that follows requires careful engagement with what each major tradition has articulated. The Christian tradition has developed perhaps the most extensive theological framework for understanding suffering through its doctrine of theologia crucis, the theology of the cross. The doctrine, articulated most fully across the Christian tradition from the earliest centuries through the contemporary period, treats the suffering of Jesus on the cross as not merely an unfortunate event in the history of salvation, but as the central revelation of how God engages with the world and how human suffering participates in this divine engagement. The framework has been developed with substantial sophistication across the various Christian traditions, with the specific formulations differing across the different denominations, but the underlying recognition being consistent. The framework holds that suffering is not the absence of God's presence, but is one of the principal modes through which divine reality is encountered, with the engagement requiring the transformation of how suffering is understood, rather than the elimination of suffering itself. The foundation of this framework appears in the Hebrew scriptures that the Christian tradition received from Judaism, with the Book of Job providing one of the most philosophically sophisticated treatments of suffering in the entire ancient world. The book, composed sometime between the 7th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, addresses the question of why a righteous person should suffer through an extended dialogue between Job and his friends, followed by the divine response from the whirlwind. The framework that the book articulates rejects the simple equation between suffering and divine punishment that the friends of Job attempt to maintain, with the divine response refusing to provide the explanation that Job himself has demanded, but instead reorienting the question through the encounter with the divine reality that Job's suffering has somehow occasioned. The book has been the subject of extensive subsequent commentary across the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, with the framework continuing to provide resources for thinking about suffering that exceed what the merely therapeutic frameworks would allow. The specific structure of the Book of Job repays careful examination because of its philosophical sophistication. The book opens with a prologue in which Job is described as righteous and prosperous, with his subsequent calamities being the result of a wager between God and the Satan figure, rather than the consequence of any sin that Job has committed. The prose prologue is followed by extensive poetic dialogues in which Job's friends maintain various versions of the standard view that his suffering must be the consequence of some hidden sin, while Job insists on his own innocence and demands an explanation from God. The dialogues continue across many chapters without resolution, with each speech producing more elaborate articulations of the various positions, but none of them addressing what Job actually needs. The divine response from the whirlwind that occupies the final major section of the book provides one of the most remarkable passages in ancient religious literature. God does not answer Job's specific question about why he has suffered. God does not vindicate Job against his friends or condemn the friends against Job. God instead asks Job a series of questions about the structure of the natural world, the behavior of various wild animals, the limits of human knowledge, and the broader features of creation that exceed what Job or his friends could possibly comprehend. The questions are not answers in any conventional sense. The questions reorient Job's relationship to his suffering by reorienting his relationship to the broader reality within which his suffering occurs, with the reorientation being the means by which the engagement with suffering is transformed. The conclusion of the book, in which Job is said to have spoken rightly while his friends have not, has been the subject of substantial subsequent commentary because of its apparent puzzle. Job has accused God of injustice and demanded explanations that have not been provided. The friends have defended God's justice and attempted to explain Job's suffering in terms of standard theological categories. Yet Job is vindicated and the friends are condemned. The interpretation that has emerged across centuries of subsequent reflection holds that Job's vindication follows from his honest engagement with his suffering and his refusal to accept easy explanations that would falsify his actual experience, while the friends are condemned for offering explanations that maintain theological order at the cost of the actual reality of Job's suffering. The framework has substantial implications for the engagement with suffering, with the recognition that honest engagement matters more than theologically correct explanations being one of the features that has made the book continuously relevant. The Apostle Paul, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, articulated what has become one of the most influential treatments of suffering within the Christian tradition. The passage in the 2nd letter to the Corinthians in which Paul writes about his own thorn in the flesh, an unspecified affliction that he repeatedly prayed for God to remove, has been the subject of extensive subsequent reflection. Paul's account holds that he received the divine response that grace was sufficient for him, and that power is made perfect in weakness, with the framework being one in which the persistent suffering becomes the means through which a deeper engagement with divine reality is established. The framework does not eliminate the suffering or claim that the suffering is somehow good in itself. The framework treats the suffering as the occasion through which a different kind of strength becomes possible, with the implications for understanding the relationship between suffering and human flourishing being substantial. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, developed the Christian engagement with suffering with characteristic philosophical sophistication. His extensive treatments of the problem of evil across his theological works, including The City of God and his various anti-Manichaean writings, articulated frameworks within which suffering is understood as the consequence of disordered freedom rather than as the direct creation of divine reality, with the framework providing one of the most influential responses to the philosophical problem that suffering raises for traditional theism. The framework has been controversial across subsequent Christian thought, with various theologians offering important modifications, but the framework has continued to shape how the Christian tradition has engaged with these questions across more than 15 centuries. The mystical tradition within Christianity has developed particularly sophisticated treatments of how suffering operates within the spiritual life. The work of John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish Carmelite mystic whose writings on the dark night of the soul have been among the most influential in the entire mystical tradition, articulated a framework within which specific forms of spiritual suffering are understood as necessary stages in the development of authentic relationship with divine reality. The framework distinguishes between the dark night of the senses, in which the consolations of the spiritual life are removed to detach the practitioner from these consolations, and the dark night of the spirit, in which the deeper structures of the false self are dissolved through the encounter with divine reality that exceeds what the false self can encompass. The framework has been controversial in some applications, with critics noting that the framework can be misapplied to circumstances of clinical depression or other conditions that require different forms of treatment. But the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between suffering and spiritual transformation that continues to influence contemporary contemplative practice. The work of Teresa of Avila, the contemporary of John of the Cross, whose interior castle has been one of the most influential treatments of the spiritual life within the Christian mystical tradition, addresses suffering with characteristic depth and practical wisdom. Teresa's framework, developed across her extensive writings, treats suffering as one of the principal means through which the soul is brought into deeper engagement with divine reality, with the engagement requiring the cultivation of specific dispositions towards suffering that the contemplative life develops. The framework integrates the mystical recognitions of how suffering operates with the practical guidance for those who encounter suffering in their actual lives, with the integration being one of the features that has made Teresa's writings continuously relevant across the centuries since their composition. The Buddhist tradition has placed suffering at the center of its entire framework with a directness that few other traditions have matched. The Four Noble Truths that constitute the foundation of Buddhist teaching begin with the recognition that dukkha, suffering or unsatisfactoriness, is the fundamental condition of unenlightened existence. The recognition is not the pessimistic claim that life is merely painful or that suffering is the only feature of existence. The recognition is the more sophisticated claim that the unsatisfactoriness that pervades ordinary experience is the fundamental condition that the contemplative path addresses, with the path being precisely the work of engaging with this condition rather than merely enduring it. The specific characterization of dukkha in the Buddhist tradition has been articulated with substantial sophistication across the various Buddhist schools. The dukkha of ordinary suffering, including physical pain, emotional distress, and the various other forms of suffering that ordinary life produces, is one form. The dukkha of change, the suffering that follows from the impermanence of all conditioned phenomena, including the pleasant experiences that ordinary life produces, is a second form. The dukkha of conditioned existence itself, the more subtle suffering that follows from the basic structure of unenlightened consciousness, regardless of the specific contents of any particular moment, is a third form. The framework provides a comprehensive analysis of suffering that exceeds what the merely physiological framework would capture, with the analysis being grounded in careful contemplative observation rather than merely theoretical speculation. The Buddhist analysis of the relationship between suffering and craving deserves particular attention because of its philosophical sophistication. The second of the Four Noble Truths identifies tanha, often translated as craving or thirst, as the proximate cause of dukkha. The framework holds that the unsatisfactoriness of ordinary experience follows substantially from the relationship between consciousness and the contents of experience, with the consciousness that grasps after pleasant contents and rejects unpleasant contents, producing the suffering that the framework identifies. The framework does not eliminate the reality of the unpleasant contents that suffering involves. The framework identifies the relationship between consciousness and these contents as the locus where the suffering can be addressed, with the third noble truth being the recognition that the cessation of suffering is possible through the transformation of this relationship rather than through the elimination of the unpleasant contents themselves. The work of Shantideva, the 8th century Indian Buddhist monk whose Bodhicharyavatara has been one of the most influential works in the Mahayana tradition, addressed the engagement with suffering with particular practical depth. The 6th chapter of the work, devoted to the perfection of patience, articulates a sustained framework for transforming the relationship to the various forms of suffering that conscious existence encounters. The framework that Shantideva articulates does not eliminate the suffering, or claim that the suffering is somehow good. The framework identifies specific cognitive and emotional dispositions that transform how the suffering is experienced, with the transformation being one of the central concerns of the Bodhisattva path. The work has continued to be one of the most widely studied texts within Tibetan Buddhism, with the framework having been translated and commented upon across centuries of subsequent practice. The specific arguments that Shantideva develops in the Patience chapter repay careful examination because of their philosophical and practical sophistication. Shantideva argues that the relationship to suffering that ordinary anger and frustration produce is itself the source of additional suffering beyond what the original conditions would produce. The framework holds that the cultivation of patience involves not the suppression of legitimate responses to harm, but the transformation of the cognitive and emotional patterns through which harm is processed, with the transformation reducing the suffering that follows from the original harm, rather than denying that the harm has occurred. The framework has been one of the most influential Buddhist contributions to thinking about the relationship between suffering and the cognitive responses that ordinarily amplify it. Shantideva's specific analysis of the relationship between expectation and suffering provides additional resources for understanding why suffering operates the way it does. The framework holds that much of the suffering that ordinary consciousness produces follows from the discrepancy between expected and actual circumstances, with the cultivation of more accurate expectations about the conditions of conscious existence, reducing the suffering that the discrepancy produces. The framework has parallels with the contemporary predictive processing framework that we examined in the earlier stage of the inquiry, with the convergence between Shantideva's 8th century philosophical analysis and the contemporary neuroscience being one of the more striking convergences in the comparative study of these questions. The Tibetan Buddhist practice of Tonglen, sending and taking, provides one of the most distinctive Buddhist practices for engaging with suffering. The practice involves the deliberate cultivation of openness to the suffering of others, with the practitioner imagining the suffering being taken in on the inhalation and well-being being sent out on the exhalation. The practice has been controversial in some applications, with critics noting that the practice can be psychologically demanding for those who have not developed the contemplative capacities that the practice presupposes. But the practice articulates a recognition that the engagement with suffering can be one of the means by which compassion is cultivated and the practitioner's relationship to suffering is transformed. The work of Pema Chodron and other contemporary Buddhist teachers has made these practices accessible to wider audiences while preserving the depth that the original tradition developed. The Islamic tradition has developed its own substantial framework for understanding suffering through the concept of sabr, often translated as patience or steadfastness, but carrying meanings that exceed what either English term fully captures. The Quranic foundation for this framework appears in numerous passages, with the verse 2 to 155 identifying various forms of testing including loss of life, loss of property, hunger, and fear, and instructing the believer to give good news to those who maintain sabr in these circumstances. The verse 2 to 153 instructs the believer to seek help through sabr and prayer, with God being identified as with those who maintain sabr. The framework has been developed across more than 14 centuries of Islamic spiritual life, with the specific articulations varying across the different schools, but the underlying recognition being consistent. The framework of ibtila, often translated as testing or trial, provides additional resources within the Islamic tradition for understanding suffering. The framework holds that the difficulties of human life are not merely random misfortunes, but are the means through which the believer is tested and through which the believer's relationship with the divine reality is developed. The framework has been controversial in some applications, with critics noting that the framework can be misapplied to circumstances of injustice that should be addressed rather than accepted. But the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between suffering and spiritual development that has shaped Islamic spiritual life across centuries. The integration of the sabr and ibtila frameworks produces one of the most sophisticated traditional accounts of how suffering can be engaged within the broader religious life. The Sufi mystical tradition has developed these frameworks with particular sophistication across its various schools and orders. The Persian Sufi poet Jalal al-Din Rumi, whose Mesnavi has been one of the most widely read poetic works in the Islamic world, addressed suffering across his vast corpus with characteristic depth. The famous verse in which Rumi observes that the wound is the place where the light enters captures a recognition that has parallels in various other traditions, but that Rumi articulated with particular poetic depth. The verse does not romanticize suffering or claim that suffering is somehow good in itself. The verse articulates the recognition that the openings that suffering produces in the structure of ordinary self-consciousness can become the means through which deeper dimensions of reality become accessible, with the implications for how suffering can be engaged being substantial. The specific image of the wound as the place where the light enters deserves careful examination because of its philosophical depth. The image does not suggest that the wound itself is the light, with the framework not making the popular claim that suffering is somehow inherently good. The image suggests that the structure of ordinary self-consciousness, with its various defenses and patterns of self-protection, can be so completely closed that nothing exceeding it can be encountered, and that the wounding of this structure produces openings through which dimensions of reality that exceed the ordinary self can become accessible. The framework treats suffering as occasion rather than as cause, with the suffering producing the conditions through which transformation becomes possible without itself being the source of the transformation. The careful articulation of this distinction is one of the features that distinguishes the genuine Sufi tradition from the various popular distortions that have emerged in contemporary spiritual literature. Rumi's broader engagement with suffering across his Mesnevi addresses the various forms of suffering that conscious existence encounters with characteristic depth. The framework that Rumi articulates treats suffering as one of the principal means through which the soul is brought into deeper engagement with divine reality, with the engagement requiring the transformation of how the suffering is understood, rather than the elimination of the suffering itself. The verses on the relationship between separation and longing, with the longing for union with the divine being itself a form of suffering that Rumi treats as the foundation of authentic spiritual life, articulate one of the most distinctive Sufi contributions to the broader inquiry into suffering. The framework has parallels with the Christian recognitions of the relationship between suffering and union with God that the mystical tradition has articulated. With the convergence between these traditions, despite their substantial theological differences, being one of the features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals, the opening of Rumi's Mesnevi, with its image of the reed flute cut from the reed bed and crying for its origin, captures the specifically Sufi recognition that the suffering that constitutes the foundation of conscious existence is the suffering of separation from the source. The framework treats this suffering not as a problem to be eliminated, but as the very condition that makes the spiritual journey possible, with the longing that the suffering produces being the energy that propels the soul toward its proper destination. The framework has been controversial in some applications, with critics noting that the framework can be misapplied to romanticize suffering in ways that the Sufi tradition itself would not endorse. But the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between suffering and the spiritual journey that has shaped Sufi practice across more than 7 centuries since Rumi's composition. The framework of fana, the annihilation of the false self that the Sufi path cultivates, provides additional resources within the Islamic tradition for understanding suffering. The framework holds that the deeper engagement with divine reality requires the dissolution of the patterns of self-protection that ordinarily constitute the false self, with the dissolution being itself a form of suffering that the spiritual path must engage. The framework has been articulated with substantial sophistication across the various Sufi orders, with the specific formulations differing but the underlying recognition being consistent. The convergence between this Sufi framework and the Christian mystical recognitions about the dark night of the soul that we considered earlier is striking, with the cross-traditional convergence on the relationship between suffering and the dissolution of the false self being one of the features that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The work of Yunus Emre, the 13th and 14th century Turkish Sufi poet, whose verses have shaped Turkish religious sensibility across centuries, articulated the engagement with suffering, with characteristic accessibility and depth. The recurring theme in his poetry of Sile, often translated as ordeal or suffering but carrying meanings that include the sustained engagement with suffering that the spiritual life requires, captures a recognition that has resonated across centuries of Turkish religious life. The framework that Yunus articulates treats Sile as one of the principal modes through which the soul is purified and the deeper engagement with divine reality is established, with the engagement being one of the central concerns of the spiritual journey. The continuing influence of Yunus's verses across contemporary Turkish religious life demonstrates the enduring relevance of these frameworks for the engagement with suffering. The specific characterization of Sile in Yunus's poetry deserves attention because of its phenomenological precision. The Sile is not merely the passive endurance of suffering, but is the active engagement with suffering through the cultivation of specific dispositions that the spiritual tradition has refined. The framework treats the period of Sile as a distinct phase of the spiritual journey rather than as a problem to be eliminated, with the phase having its own structure and its own meaning that the spiritual life must engage rather than avoid. The convergence between Yunus's framework and the various other traditional accounts of how suffering operates within the spiritual life is striking, with a cross-traditional recognition that suffering has structural features that the merely therapeutic framework cannot capture, being one of the consistent themes that the comparative study of these traditions reveals. The Hadith tradition within Islamic literature contains numerous specific teachings about the relationship between suffering and divine love. The famous Hadith that holds that God tests those whom God loves articulates a framework that has been developed extensively across the Islamic tradition, with the framework providing resources for understanding why apparent injustice in the distribution of suffering may have meanings that exceed what the merely surface view of events would suggest. The framework has been controversial in some applications, but the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between divine love and human suffering that has shaped Islamic spiritual life across centuries. The integration of the Hadith material with the Quranic foundations and the Sufi mystical articulations produces one of the most extensive traditional bodies of reflection on suffering that any tradition has developed. The Hindu tradition has articulated its own framework for understanding suffering through the concept of dvandva, the pairs of opposites that constitute the structure of embodied experience. The framework, developed across thousands of years within the broader Hindu philosophical tradition, treats the various dualities of pleasure and pain, success and failure, honor and dishonor, and similar pairs as features of the embodied existence that the spiritual life works to engage rather than to eliminate. The framework has been articulated with substantial sophistication across the various Hindu schools, with the specific formulations differing but the underlying recognition being consistent. The Bhagavad Gita addresses suffering at multiple points across its 18 chapters, with the second chapter providing one of the most concentrated treatments. The dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna at the beginning of the Battle of Kurukshetra, in which Arjuna is overwhelmed by the suffering that the imminent battle will produce, becomes the occasion for Krishna's extended teaching on the nature of conscious existence and the appropriate relationship to the various circumstances that the embodied life encounters. The framework that emerges from the Gita treats suffering as one of the dvandva that the embodied life cannot eliminate, but that the practice of karma yoga can transform through the cultivation of action without attachment to results. The framework has been the foundation of substantial subsequent practice within Hindu spiritual life, with the implications for how suffering can be engaged being significant. The Hindu concept of tapas, often translated as austerity or spiritual discipline, provides a complementary framework for understanding the relationship between suffering and spiritual development. The framework holds that the deliberate cultivation of certain forms of difficulty produces the inner strength that the spiritual life requires, with the framework being grounded in the recognition that growth often follows from the engagement with, rather than the avoidance of difficulty. The framework has been controversial in some applications, with critics noting that the framework can be misapplied to produce excessive asceticism that damages rather than develops the practitioner. But the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between difficulty and spiritual development that has parallels in the various other traditions that have addressed these questions. The Stoic philosophical tradition contains its own articulation of the engagement with suffering through frameworks that have been developed across more than 2,000 years of subsequent influence. The Stoic philosophers, including Zeno of Citium, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, articulated frameworks within which suffering is understood as one of the indifferent features of existence that does not affect the fundamental virtue that the philosophical life cultivates. The framework distinguishes between what is in our power and what is not in our power, with the recognition that suffering, as ordinarily understood, is largely not in our power, being one of the central insights of the tradition. The work of Epictetus, summarized in the Enchiridion that his student Arrian compiled from his teachings, provides one of the most accessible articulations of these frameworks for general readers. The work of Marcus Aurelius, written during the periods between his administrative duties as Roman emperor in the late 2nd century of the Common Era, has been one of the most widely read Stoic works across the centuries since its composition. The Meditations contains numerous reflections on the engagement with suffering and on the disposition that the philosophical life requires for engaging with the various circumstances that life produces. The framework that Marcus articulates treats the suffering that the various circumstances of life produce as material for the practice of the philosophical life, rather than as obstacles to that life, with the implications for how suffering can be engaged being substantial even for readers who do not share the specific Stoic metaphysical commitments. The specific Stoic distinction between things in our power and things not in our power, articulated most clearly by Epictetus and developed by Marcus Aurelius, provides resources for the engagement with suffering that have parallels in various other traditions. The framework holds that our judgments about events, our intentions, and our responses are in our power, while external events, including most of the circumstances that produce suffering, are not. The implications for the engagement with suffering are direct. The engagement should be focused on what is in our power, with the cultivation of judgments and responses that transform the relationship to circumstances being possible, even when the circumstances themselves cannot be changed. The framework has been controversial in some applications, but the framework articulates a recognition about the relationship between agency and suffering that has continued to influence philosophical thinking across centuries. What emerges across these various traditions, despite their profound differences in cultural context and theological commitment, is a structural recognition that has clear parallels to what contemporary research has begun to document about suffering. The traditions consistently treat suffering as more than the merely physiological phenomenon that the materialist framework treats it as. The traditions consistently distinguish between different forms of suffering with different transformative potentials, with the Christian distinction between dark nights and clinical depression, the Buddhist analysis of 3 forms of dukkha, the Islamic distinction between sabr-worthy testing and unjust suffering that should be addressed, and the Stoic distinction between what is in our power and what is not, all articulating versions of this recognition. The traditions consistently develop practices for engaging with suffering, with the practices ranging from contemplative engagement that the Christian tradition has developed to the meditation on dukkha that the Buddhist tradition has refined, to the cultivation of sabr that the Islamic tradition has articulated, and the traditions consistently locate suffering within broader frameworks of meaning that connect the individual experience to larger patterns that the individual existence participates in. The convergence is not equivalence. The Christian theologia, crucis, is not the Buddhist dukkha, is not the Islamic sabr, is not the Hindu dvandva, is not the Stoic disposition toward indifference. Each tradition is doing its own work, with its own commitments, in its own context. The vocabularies differ. The metaphysical frameworks differ profoundly. What they share, despite these differences, is the recognition that suffering is woven into the structure of conscious existence in ways that the merely physiological framework cannot adequately capture, that the cultivation of relationship to suffering is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, and that the contemporary research is now in a position to engage seriously with what the traditions have been articulating across thousands of years. The next stage of the inquiry will examine what these recognitions, taken together with the contemporary research that has been documenting the biology and physics of suffering, suggest for how a person can inhabit the embodied existence in which suffering is one of the principal dimensions through which conscious life is constituted. The suffering that constitutes one of the most consistent dimensions of your embodied existence is not the meaningless biological signal that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to dismiss it as. It is not the merely physiological phenomenon that the materialist medical framework reduces it to. It is not the random misfortune that the standard secular narrative has often treated it as. It is not the deserved punishment that some forms of religious thinking have suggested it could be. It is not the vibrational frequency problem that the popular spiritual literature has claimed it might be. The suffering is something more sophisticated than any of these reductions allows, with the something more being precisely what the inquiry has been working to articulate. The suffering that you carry has structural features that contemporary neuroscience has begun to characterize in detail. The suffering has implications that contemporary physics provides resources for thinking about. The suffering has dimensions that the world's deepest contemplative traditions have engaged with the kind of seriousness that the popular contemporary frameworks rarely match. The synthesis that follows draws together the various strands of the inquiry. The synthesis is not the final word on questions that remain genuinely open. The synthesis is the recognition of what the convergent evidence suggests, of what objections honest investigation has to acknowledge, and of what specific implications follow for how a person can inhabit a life in which suffering is one of the principal dimensions through which conscious experience is constituted. Before drawing out the implications, intellectual honesty requires examining the objections to everything that has been argued. The picture we have built is not the only available reading of the evidence, and several alternative views have serious philosophical and scientific defenders. Any account that ignores them is a form of intellectual cheating. The first and most important objection comes from the materialist position that has been the dominant framework in mainstream pain research for the past several decades. The position holds that suffering is, at its deepest level, the operation of specific neural mechanisms that contemporary neuroscience has worked to characterize in detail. The work of Patrick Wall and Ronald Melzack on the gate control theory, the work of Tor Wager on neural signatures of pain, the work of Carl Friston on predictive processing, the work of Howard Fields on endogenous pain modulation, and the work of countless other researchers across the past several decades has produced a substantially complete account of how suffering operates at the biological level. The position holds that this account is sufficient, with the apparent features of suffering that exceed the merely biological being, either reducible to the biology or being simply features of how the biology produces the experience of suffering. The position has serious defenders within contemporary neuroscience, and the empirical achievements of the materialist framework are substantial. The honest acknowledgement is that the materialist objection cannot be summarily dismissed. The neural mechanisms are real mechanisms. The biology of pain is increasingly characterized. The cognitive functions that pain accomplishes are well documented. What the inquiry has established is that the materialist account does not exhaust what the documented phenomena involve, with features including the qualitative character of pain experience, the social pain phenomena documented by Eisenberger, and the deeper philosophical questions about what relationship the experience of suffering has to the underlying conditions, all raising features that the merely materialist account does not adequately address. The position that suffering is reducible to biology is not the established scientific consensus that some popular accounts have presented it as. The position is one available framework among several, with serious empirical and philosophical considerations that current research has not fully resolved. The second objection focuses on the speculative status of the philosophical extensions that we have considered. The predictive processing framework, while supported by substantial empirical work and accepted by many researchers in contemporary neuroscience, remains controversial in its specific applications to consciousness and suffering. The Penrose-Hameroff orchestrated objective reduction theory, while supported by some recent empirical work, including the WE studies, remains controversial within the broader neuroscience community. The block universe interpretation of relativity, while technically correct as a mathematical framework, has not been established as the correct interpretation of the physical reality that relativity describes. The application of any of these frameworks to specific questions about suffering involves theoretical extensions that have not been definitively established. The honest acknowledgement is that the philosophical frameworks provide resources for thinking about suffering beyond the materialist framework. But the frameworks do not by themselves establish that suffering is what these frameworks suggest it might be. The third objection requires returning to the popular abuse of these themes in contemporary spiritual literature, given the substantial harm that such abuse has produced. The frameworks that treat suffering as the result of low vibrational frequencies that the sufferer can transform through specific manifestation techniques have no support in either the actual physics or the actual research on suffering. The decoherence problem documented by Max Tegmark eliminates the kind of coherent quantum states that would be required for conscious intention to modify quantum properties in the way that these popular frameworks imagine. The popular framework that the sufferer attracts their suffering through the vibrational frequency of their thoughts and can eliminate the suffering through positive thinking is incompatible with both the actual neuroscience and the actual circumstances of much human suffering. The framework has been used to dismiss the genuine suffering of those facing circumstances that no amount of correct thinking can change, with the documented consequences having included worsening of treatable conditions when sufferers have delayed medical treatment in favor of vibrational practices, and in some documented cases, premature death. The careful position requires the explicit rejection of these popular frameworks while preserving the recognition that contemplative engagement with suffering, conducted within the moral and spiritual seriousness of the actual contemplative traditions, has substantial value. The specific harm that the manifestation framework has produced deserves more direct examination because the framework continues to be widely promoted and continues to produce real consequences in the lives of vulnerable people. The framework has been applied to cancer patients with the implication that their cancer follows from their inadequate vibrational state, with the documented consequences, in some cases, having included the rejection of evidence-based treatment in favor of vibrational practices and the progression of treatable cancers to incurable stages. The framework has been applied to victims of violence with the implication that the violence followed from their inadequate vibrational state, with the documented consequences having included additional psychological harm to victims who were already suffering. The framework has been applied to those grieving the deaths of loved ones, with the implication that the death followed from the loved one's inadequate vibrational state, with the documented consequences having included the destruction of communities of support during periods when such support was most needed. The harm is real and continuing, and the careful inquiry into suffering has to acknowledge this harm rather than dismissing it as merely theoretical. The careful contemplative traditions that we have examined did not teach the manifestation framework in any of these forms. The Christian tradition teaches that providence operates within the broader structure of moral and natural causation, rather than as the direct response to individual vibrational states. The Islamic tradition teaches that qadar encompasses the various circumstances of human life within the divine knowledge and will, but the tradition does not teach that human beings attract specific circumstances through their vibrational states. The Hindu tradition teaches that karma operates across the broader span of conscious existence, But the tradition does not teach the simple mechanical relationship between current thoughts and current circumstances that the manifestation framework imagines. The Buddhist tradition teaches that mental patterns shape experience, but the tradition does not teach that physical illness or external misfortune follows mechanically from mental patterns in the manifestation framework's specific way. The popular distortions have abandoned the moral and spiritual seriousness of the actual traditions while retaining the surface vocabulary, with the abandonment being the source of the harm that the popular distortions have produced. The fourth objection concerns the toxic positivity framework that has emerged in contemporary self-help culture. The framework treats the expression of suffering as itself a problem to be eliminated, with the implication being that those who acknowledge their suffering are creating their suffering through the very acknowledgement. The framework has been criticized by various contemporary psychologists, with the work of Susan David at Harvard Medical School on emotional agility documenting that the suppression of difficult emotions tends to amplify rather than reduce the suffering associated with them. The framework that the contemporary research supports treats the acknowledgement and engagement with difficult emotions as one of the means by which the suffering associated with those emotions can be transformed, with the framework being substantially supported by both the contemporary research and the recognitions that the contemplative traditions have articulated about the appropriate engagement with suffering. The honest engagement with suffering requires resisting the toxic positivity framework, while also resisting the opposite extreme of wallowing in suffering that some forms of contemporary culture have encouraged. The specific harm that the toxic positivity framework produces in social contexts deserves examination, because the framework has become widespread in contemporary culture. The framework has been used to dismiss the legitimate complaints of those suffering from chronic conditions, with the implication being that their complaints are creating or worsening their suffering. The framework has been used to silence those suffering from mental health conditions, with the implication being that the expression of their difficulties is itself a problem to be eliminated. The framework has been used to undermine collective responses to systemic injustice, with the implication being that complaints about unjust circumstances reflect the complainer's inadequate emotional state rather than the actual injustice that the complaints address. The careful engagement with suffering requires resisting these applications of the toxic positivity framework, while preserving the legitimate recognition that the cultivation of constructive responses to difficulty is one of the means by which suffering can be transformed. The fifth objection concerns the related popular framework that romanticizes suffering as inherently good or as somehow necessary for spiritual development. The framework, articulated in various forms across popular spiritual literature, holds that suffering is a gift that the sufferer should welcome rather than resist, with the implication being that the elimination of suffering would be itself a problem. The framework has been used to dismiss legitimate concerns about preventable suffering and to discourage those who suffer from seeking appropriate treatment. The careful contemplative traditions that we have examined did not teach this framework. The Christian tradition teaches that suffering can become the occasion through which divine reality is encountered, but the tradition does not teach that suffering is inherently good, or that the elimination of suffering through appropriate means is somehow problematic. The Buddhist tradition teaches that the relationship to suffering can be transformed, but the tradition does not teach that suffering is itself good, or that the relief of suffering is not a legitimate concern. The Sufi tradition's recognition that the wound can be the place where the light enters does not romanticize the wound itself. The honest engagement with these traditional frameworks requires preserving the distinction between the actual teachings and the popular romanticizations that have distorted them. The sixth objection concerns the difference between healthy and unhealthy forms of engagement with suffering. The contemplative traditions have all recognized that not every relationship to suffering is a manifestation of the deeper engagement that the traditions cultivate. Some relationships involve excessive identification with the suffering, with the sufferer becoming so absorbed in the suffering that the broader life cannot proceed. Some relationships involve obsessive examination of past suffering, with the experiencer being unable to engage with the present because of the constant return to past events. Some relationships involve the use of suffering as a means of obtaining attention or sympathy in ways that prevent the actual engagement with the suffering that would allow it to be transformed. The contemplative traditions have all developed resources for distinguishing the genuine engagement with suffering from these various distorted forms, with the discernment being one of the central disciplines that the traditions cultivate. The honest engagement with the inquiry's themes requires preserving these distinctions rather than collapsing them into the simpler frameworks that popular literature has often offered. The seventh objection concerns the relationship between the various contemplative traditions whose articulations the inquiry has examined. The traditions are not equivalent, and treating them as if they were equivalent does violence to the specific commitments of each. The Christian Theologia Crucis, with its specific commitments about the relationship between human suffering and the suffering of Christ, is not the same as the Buddhist Dukkha framework, with its specific commitments about the relationship between suffering and the structure of unenlightened consciousness. The Islamic Sabr, with its specific commitments about the relationship between human testing and divine providence, is not the same as the Hindu Dvandva framework, with its specific commitments about the embodied existence within the broader spiritual journey. The Stoic disposition toward indifference, with its specific commitments about virtue and what is in our power, is not the same as any of the religious frameworks that ground their treatments of suffering in commitments about divine reality. The differences matter. The differences are not surface features that can be dissolved into a common essence without losing what each tradition is actually saying. The honest engagement requires acknowledging the differences while also acknowledging the structural parallels. When all of these objections have been weighed, what survives is not a metaphysical certainty but a structural picture that holds up under examination. The neuroscience documents real phenomena that exceed what the simplest materialist framework allows. The philosophical extensions provide frameworks within which these phenomena can be understood without forcing them into the merely materialist mold. The contemplative traditions have articulated, in their own different vocabularies, structurally parallel pictures of what suffering actually is and what role it plays in conscious existence. The convergences are real, even as the specific frameworks of science, philosophy, and tradition remain distinct, and the implications for how a person can understand the suffering that constitutes a significant dimension of their existence follow from the recognition rather than from any specific metaphysical commitment. The picture has connections to many other strands of inquiry that have been pursued in this larger investigation. The recognition that memory is reconstructive rather than archival has direct implications for understanding the persistence of traumatic suffering. With the work on memory reconsolidation that Karim Nader and Daniela Schiller have developed, providing both theoretical resources for understanding traumatic memory and practical resources for transforming it. The traumatic memories that produce persistent suffering are not, on this framework, fixed records of past events that the sufferer must endure, but are continuously reconstructed patterns that can be modified through specifically timed interventions. The implications for the engagement with traumatic suffering are substantial, with a recognition that the suffering produced by traumatic memory is itself modifiable rather than fixed, providing resources for therapeutic engagement that the simpler framework of trauma as permanent damage could not offer. The convergence between the contemporary research on memory reconsolidation and the contemplative tradition's frameworks for engaging with painful memories is one of the more striking convergences that this inquiry has examined. The Christian practice of forgiveness, the Buddhist practice of working with traumatic memory through mindfulness, the Sufi practice of engaging with the wounds that the spiritual journey accumulates, and various other traditional practices have all addressed the transformation of painful memory in ways that the contemporary research is now in a position to engage with seriously. The convergence is not equivalence, with the specific frameworks of the traditions remaining distinct from each other and from the contemporary research. But the parallels are real, and the implications for the integration of contemporary therapeutic approaches with the traditional contemplative practices are substantial. The recognition that the bond between persons that we have examined in connection with love includes features that exceed the merely psychological has direct implications for understanding the suffering that follows from loss of bonded persons. The work of Mary Frances O'Connor on the grieving brain has documented that the loss of close persons produces neural and physiological changes that are continuous with the changes involved in withdrawal from physical addiction, with the implications being that grief involves a kind of suffering that is structurally similar to the suffering of physical pain. The findings provide empirical support for the recognition that emotional and physical suffering are continuous rather than fundamentally different phenomena, with the recognition having parallels in the contemplative traditions that have treated all forms of suffering as variations on a unified phenomenon, rather than as fundamentally different categories. The work of Naomi Eisenberger on social pain that we examined in the earlier stage of the inquiry provides additional support for this recognition. The neural mechanisms that produce the experience of physical pain are substantially overlapping with the neural mechanisms that produce the experience of social rejection and loss, with the overlap being one of the most striking findings of contemporary social neuroscience. The implications for understanding the suffering that follows from broken relationships, betrayals, and other social wounds are substantial, with the suffering being recognized as a genuine pain at the neural level rather than merely a metaphorical pain that ordinary language has constructed. The recognition that the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death cannot be answered through the standard materialist framework has implications for understanding the suffering that follows from facing one's own mortality and the mortality of those we love. The frameworks that contemporary research has developed for understanding consciousness at death, taken together with the contemplative traditions that have addressed these questions across thousands of years, provide resources for engaging with the suffering of mortality that the merely materialist framework cannot offer. The suffering involved in facing death is not on the convergent recognitions that the inquiry has examined, the merely psychological response to an objectively meaningless event, but is the engagement with a transition whose nature exceeds what the materialist framework can capture. The implications for how the suffering of mortality should be engaged are substantial. The recognition that the question of what happens to consciousness at biological death cannot be answered through the standard materialist framework has implications for understanding the suffering that follows from facing one's own mortality and the mortality of those we love. The frameworks that contemporary research has developed for understanding consciousness at death, taken together with the contemplative traditions that have addressed these questions across thousands of years, provide resources for engaging with the suffering of mortality that the merely materialist framework cannot offer. The suffering involved in facing death is not, on the convergent recognitions that the inquiry has examined, the merely psychological response to an objectively meaningless event, but is the engagement with a transition whose nature exceeds what the materialist framework can capture. The implications for how the suffering of mortality should be engaged are substantial. The recognition that meaningful coincidences may have a structural basis that the standard frameworks cannot adequately address has implications for understanding the experiences of meaningful patterns that often emerge during periods of intense suffering. The contemplative traditions have all recognized that suffering often produces openings, through which dimensions of reality that exceed ordinary experience become accessible, with the meaningful patterns that emerge during such periods being part of what makes the suffering transformative rather than merely destructive. The synchronicity framework that we examine provides resources for understanding these phenomena without forcing them into the merely psychological category, with the implications for how the meaningful patterns that emerge during suffering should be received being substantial. The recognition that the apparent continuity of personal identity across the disruptions of sleep involves features that exceed what the merely materialist framework can capture has implications for understanding how suffering can be borne across the span of a life. The framework provides resources for understanding how the person who suffers today is the same person who will engage with the suffering tomorrow, with the continuity being something more substantial than the merely material framework would suggest. The implications for the engagement with chronic suffering are particularly significant, with the recognition that the continuity of identity across the span of suffering involves features that the merely materialist framework cannot capture, providing resources for hope that the merely physiological view of suffering would not offer. The recognition that time may not have the structure that ordinary perception suggests, articulated through the block universe interpretation of relativity, has direct implications for understanding what relationship suffering has to the past events and future moments that constitute the broader trajectory of a life. If the past exists with equal reality to the present in the broader space-time structure, then the suffering that has occurred in a life has a kind of permanence that the merely temporal view cannot capture, with the implications for thinking about the meaning of suffering across the entire span of an existence being substantial. The framework is speculative in its strongest forms, but the resources it provides for thinking about why suffering and time are connected in the specific ways that careful observation reveals are substantial. These traditions, taken together with the contemporary research and the philosophical extensions, converge on a practical orientation that bears on what to do with the recognition that has been the subject of the inquiry. The orientation involves a different relationship to suffering than the relationship that the standard cultural framework allows. The traditions have all developed practices that cultivate this different relationship, and the practices have served, across thousands of years, as the means by which the recognition is transmitted from one generation of practitioners to the next. There are particular practices that the contemplative traditions have developed for this kind of cultivation, and they are simpler than they might appear. The first is the practice of honest engagement with suffering in the manner that the Book of Job models. The practice involves the refusal to accept easy theological or therapeutic explanations that would falsify the actual reality of the suffering being experienced, with the refusal being itself one of the means by which authentic engagement with the suffering becomes possible. The practice does not require any specific religious commitment in the strong sense. The practice requires only the willingness to allow the suffering to be what it actually is rather than what various frameworks would prefer it to be, with the recognition that honest engagement matters more than theologically correct explanations being one of the central insights that Job's example provides. A second practice draws on the Shantideva tradition of cultivating patience as a transformation of the cognitive and emotional patterns that ordinarily amplify suffering. The practice involves the regular examination of the relationship between expectations and circumstances, with the recognition that much of the suffering that consciousness produces follows from the discrepancy between what is expected and what actually occurs. The practice does not require denying the reality of difficult circumstances or pretending that suffering is not occurring. The practice involves the cultivation of more accurate expectations about the conditions of conscious existence, with the cultivation reducing the additional suffering that unrealistic expectations produce on top of the suffering that the actual conditions involve. The convergence between this practice and the contemporary predictive processing framework provides a context within which the practice can be understood as working with, rather than against, the actual structure of how suffering operates. A third practice draws on the Sufi tradition of sabr and the broader Islamic tradition of engagement with suffering as testing. The practice involves the cultivation of a specific disposition towards suffering that does not resist the suffering or attempt to escape it, but engages it with the kind of sustained attention that the spiritual tradition has refined. The Mevlana framework of the wound, as the place where the light enters, provides a context within which the engagement with suffering can be conducted, with the recognition that the suffering may be the occasion through which deeper dimensions of reality become accessible. The framework does not romanticize the suffering or claim that the suffering is inherently good. The framework treats the suffering as occasion rather than as cause, with the cultivation of the appropriate disposition being one of the means by which the occasion is engaged rather than wasted. A fourth practice draws on the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of Tonglen as a means of transforming the relationship to suffering through the deliberate cultivation of compassion. The practice involves the imagining of the suffering of others being taken in on the inhalation and well-being being sent out on the exhalation, with the practice operating through specific cognitive and emotional patterns that the tradition has refined. The practice has been criticized by various contemporary teachers as being psychologically demanding for those who have not developed the contemplative capacities that the practice presupposes. With the careful introduction of the practice within the broader contemplative framework being important for its successful application, the work of contemporary Buddhist teachers, including Pema Chodron, has made the practice accessible while preserving the depth that the original tradition developed. A fifth practice draws on the Frankl tradition of meaning cultivation combined with the Stoic distinction between what is in our power and what is not. The practice involves the regular examination of one's circumstances with attention to what is actually within the practitioner's capacity to influence, combined with the cultivation of meaning that connects the engagement with circumstances to the broader trajectory of the practitioner's life. The practice does not require denying the suffering of circumstances that cannot be changed or pretending that meaning can substitute for the elimination of suffering when elimination is possible. The practice involves the integration of accurate assessment of what can and cannot be changed, with the cultivation of meaning that transforms the relationship to what cannot be changed, with the integration being one of the means by which authentic engagement with suffering becomes possible. These practices are simple, but they accumulate. Practiced over time, they shift the relationship between the sufferer and the suffering. The relationship becomes less an unconscious endurance and more a conscious engagement that contributes to the broader life. The attention to suffering becomes less an occasional crisis and more a sustained orientation that informs how the practitioner lives. The shift is not dramatic in any single instance. The shift is the gradual deepening of relationship with one of the principal dimensions through which conscious life is constituted, with the deepening being possible across the entire span of the embodied existence in which the suffering continues. This is what the inquiry has been pointing toward. Not a doctrine, not a system, not a framework that has to be believed. A recognition that the suffering that constitutes one of the most consistent dimensions of your embodied existence is not the meaningless biological signal that the dominant cultural framework has trained you to dismiss it as, while also not being the vibrational frequency problem that the popular spiritual literature has claimed it might be. A recognition that the experience of suffering involves features that exceed what the merely materialist framework can adequately address, with the features pointing toward the deeper structures of consciousness and reality that physics and philosophy and the contemplative traditions have all been working to articulate. A recognition that the cultivation of relationship to suffering is one of the legitimate concerns of conscious existence, that the cultivation can be practiced through the methods that the traditions have developed across thousands of years, and that the cultivation has effects on the embodied life that you currently have. The question of whether the philosophical and contemplative frameworks that have been examined are correct in their strongest forms is a question that no current investigation can answer with full certainty. The question of how you can inhabit a life in which suffering is one of the principal dimensions of conscious experience in light of the recognitions that the inquiry has pointed toward is a question that you are in a position to answer through the choices you make and the practices you cultivate. The body that reads these words has, across the years of its existence, accumulated suffering that constitutes substantial portions of the felt sense of what your life has been. The pain that you have carried, whether the acute pain of specific injuries or the chronic pain of conditions that have not been resolved, whether the social pain of losses and rejections, or the existential pain of confronting the conditions of your existence, is not the merely random suffering that the materialist framework would suggest. The suffering has structural features. The suffering has connections to dimensions of reality that exceed what the merely physiological framework can capture. The suffering may be one of the principal modes through which conscious existence engages with reality at depths that pleasure and comfort cannot access. None of this is a justification for unnecessary suffering. None of this is a reason to avoid the legitimate treatment of treatable suffering or the elimination of suffering that can be eliminated. The recognition is not that suffering is good, but that suffering, when it cannot be eliminated and must be borne, has features that exceed what the merely materialist framework allows. The suffering that you will carry tomorrow and the day after, and across the remaining span of your existence, is not yet what it will be. The patterns through which you will engage with this suffering, the dispositions you will bring to the moments when the suffering is most acute, the meaning that you will find or construct as the suffering continues, are not yet fixed. The choice of how to engage what is to come, with what quality of attention and what depth of recognition, is the choice that constitutes one of the central forms of your conscious life. You have time. The time is finite. The suffering that constitutes one of the principal dimensions of embodied existence will continue, with the embodied form of its continuation being constrained by the same biological mortality that constrains all other dimensions of your existence. What you do with the suffering, what kind of relationship you cultivate with this central feature of your existence, is among the most consequential dimensions of how you inhabit the life you have. The recognition that the inquiry has been pointing toward will not be available to you in the moments when it is most needed as a theoretical framework for analysis. The recognition will be available, if it is available at all, as the cultivated background that has informed your engagement with the suffering of your life across the years that preceded the moments. The cultivation matters. The practices matter. The recognition that suffering is something more than what the materialist framework allows, while also something different from what the popular spiritual literature has claimed, is a recognition that produces its effects through the gradual transformation of how the sufferer engages with the trajectory of their existence. The suffering will continue. The patterns will continue to appear. What you make of them is the question whose answer you are in a position to develop through the practices you cultivate and the discernment you bring to the moments of suffering that punctuate your existence. The wound that you carry is not the only thing you are. The wound is also not nothing. The wound is the place through which something exceeds what you would have been if the wound had never occurred, with the exceeding being possible only because the wound is real rather than merely apparent. You did not choose the wound. You can choose what you do with it. The choice is yours alone to make. The suffering that has shaped you across the years of your existence is not stored somewhere outside you as a record of what has happened. The suffering is happening now in the very construction of who you are as a continuous being engaging with this present moment. The construction draws on patterns that have been shaped by previous suffering, but the construction itself occurs in the present moment, with each act of engagement with suffering being a present act rather than the playing out of something completed in the past. The implications for how you understand who you are follow directly. You are not the person who has accumulated a record of past suffering. You are the person who is constructing the experience of having had that suffering right now, in the present moment, as the embodied life continues. This recognition does not diminish the reality of what you carry from your past. The recognition transforms how you understand what carrying actually involves, with the carrying being an active process rather than a passive storage. What you do with this active process, how you participate in the engagement with suffering through the practices you cultivate, and the discernment you bring to the moments of suffering that punctuate your existence, is the question whose answer you are in a position to develop across the remaining span of your conscious life.